And our pastor, again, he knew nothing about deliverance. He knew as much as we knew. He walked across the circle that was around the campfire, and this woman that I described, she was there. There was always something unusual about her. She had this very dark look to her face, almost like she'd been smeared with ash. There was a distant kind of gaze in her eyes. Many times, if you looked in her eyes, it was like they were a bottomless pit of blackness. And she would periodically just spontaneously vocalize profanities and blasphemy and other things. People kind of wondered, but again, we didn't have any context, and this was a church that just didn't have any background with this. And I mean, I didn't have anything, and we didn't do this in the Wesleyan tradition, and our pastor knew nothing. So we're just, here we are. He walks across the circle and he puts his hands on her head, and he said her name. And then he said, "Can you say Jesus is Lord?" And she went berserk. She threw him back through the air, and he landed in the fire.
It's time for another episode of the Sean Tabbitt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is my friend Ken Fish, and we're going to be talking about his journey into deliverance ministry. You may have noticed this is a theme we've been focusing on for the last 6 or so months. And hey, we're going to continue focusing on this topic again as we head into 2022. Ken, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you again and be back.
Yes, definitely my pleasure. I'm glad we've finally been able to connect after, I think it's been at least 4 or 5 years since we sat down for coffee and connected in person. However, you and I have a lot of the same mutual friends, but I know inevitably you're going to be new to some of my audience. So let's kick this off by having you share a bit of the Ken Fish origin story. So for somebody meeting you for the first time in our talk today, what are a few things we should know about you?
Well, I was raised in I would say, predominantly Christian family, which I'm not even sure how common that is anymore. I talk to a lot of people that, they say they were raised in a Christian home, but the more you explore what that means, it's not always clear that what they mean by Christian and what the Bible means by Christian are the same thing. But in my particular case, my father died when I was very young, and not exactly the thing I wear on my sleeve, but my mother could not afford to keep me. So she shipped me off to her parents. And so I was raised part of the year by my mother and part of the year by my grandparents. My grandparents were very devout Wesleyan Methodists, not United Methodists, none of the other branches of Methodism, Wesleyan Methodist, if you please, which is more of a holiness strain of the Methodist movement. And my grandma and grandpa, again, fun fact here, they were converted in a literal tent revival. I mean, literally in a tent in the very early 20th century. So the American historian Frederick Jackson Turner once wrote that the American frontier closed in 1902. So this was not long after the quote unquote closing of the American frontier. Following that, my grandparents were ultimately married, and of course they had children. And then my mother was one of those children, one of 5. So anyway, the guy who was leading that tent revival, who literally rode into town on a horse, he was a horseback riding preacher, because in those years cars had been invented, but they were not yet common. He was himself a disciple of Francis Asbury. So, we like to talk about spiritual sons and spiritual grandsons and spiritual daughters and spiritual granddaughters. We do all that a lot these days. No one was using that kind of language, but somehow that came down from Asbury. And most historians of American religion would say that Francis Asbury was the most important person in American Christianity in the history of America. More than Billy Graham, more than Jonathan Edwards, more than George Whitefield. His statue stands in the Capitol Rotunda, although I suppose at some point cancel culture will catch up with him and he'll be removed. And Asbury was himself a disciple of John Wesley. So that's kind of my spiritual heritage. And so I grew up in that. My mother was not as ardent as my grandparents, but I got a good dose of that ardent Wesleyan holiness teaching when I was a kid. And So it kind of set the course for me in a lot of ways. I mean, I had my youthful, I would say, drift. I don't know if I ever went deep into the world of sin, but I drifted a little bit for a little while in high school, but it wasn't very long and it wasn't very deep. So I'm not like a lot of our guests that, they come out of backgrounds that are, it's almost like if you haven't been a drug dealer, maybe a prostitute, you haven't killed at least two people and done hard time, you don't actually have a testimony. My testimony is more that God kept me from a lot of really bad stuff by his grace and goodness, and also the watchful oversight of respectively my grandparents and my mother. And so I just have a very different story than many people do.
And Ken, it sounds like, would it be fair to say, I mean, could you classify that as a conservative upbringing, at least like spiritually, religiously? Or,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, just to frame the context a bit, when I lived with my grandparents, which was about 6 months a year, they had a farm before they moved to the city in their latter years, but they still kept the schedule of the farm, which among other things meant that we ate our big meal at noontime, and we ate a light, what they called supper, around 5 in the evening. Well, after we had our main meal, what we called dinner, at noontime, and of course that was holdover from the farm because you still had to go out and work a half day, heavy labor, in the fields, plowing, cutting, whatever you were doing. So you needed that big meal for energy, for calories. Anyway, after we would do that every day, no exceptions, the Bible would come out, and it was a King James Bible. And we would read through the Bible. And my grandmother was quite a teacher of the scriptures. In fact, the Wesleyan Conference would hold what's called a camp meeting every year in Hastings, Michigan. And I remember going with her a number of times to those meetings where she was a featured speaker. And she would regularly fill a pavilion, which is a fancier word for tent, with 5,000 people, every seat filled. And I would get a seat on the front row because I was her grandson. And so people came from everywhere to hear her teach and preach the Bible. Well, I got my own tutorial every day at noontime after the meal. And so we would read through it. We would talk about it. If I didn't understand something, she would explain it. I became comfortable with King James English. I no longer read a King James Bible, but if I pick one up, I'm not confused by the, out of date language that, we just don't speak that way anymore. So I'm kind of like, I think in some ways I'm an anachronism because I'm one of the last sort of younger readers of the King James Bible. And I grew up in a home where people actually did read the Bible as a family. And I mean, I've talked with hundreds and thousands of people in my travels, and virtually no one, I mean, there have been a couple, but virtually no one that I know has ever done family Bible reading when they were a kid, done it with their own children, or even knows anybody who's ever done it. And yet this was the way, at least my piece of America was, because as devout Wesleyans, I mean, this was part of what you did. Everything you thought, everything you said, everything you framed your reality based on the Word of God. And how were you going to do that if you didn't know the Word of God? And it surely was not enough just to hand someone a Bible and say, here, read it. And so in many, many ways, I was very fortunate to have been raised with the scriptures as part of my framing worldview. And as a result of that, a lot of times when I would be tempted or, drawn towards something, a lot of times I would just be stopped cold because I knew it was wrong. And in the back of my mind, I would be thinking, I can't do that. I'm John Walbert's grandson or Dorothy Walbert's grandson, depending on whether it was my grandfather or grandmother. I just knew this was not acceptable in the mind of God. And, anyone who knows me and has heard me speak and teach, they see and sense that tendens within everything I do and say. The scriptures govern everything that I think about. Even in the modern period, there are some things, of course, the Bible doesn't speak to directly. There's no mention of cell phones or COVID vaccines or, any number of things like this. But the fact of the matter is, when we think about how we ought to order our lives, how we ought to spend our days, what should be our priorities, these are clearly and unambiguously laid out in Scripture. And I think a great part of the malaise that's on the modern church is that, if I'm honest, most Christians don't know the Bible, and that's because most Christians don't read the Bible. And I could add to that, many preachers don't really preach the Bible. They'll take a verse or two and they'll talk about something that's kind of a known theme. We might say a well-worn trope, although that has some negative connotations. And I say all the time, if we think we're going to have a reformation, we're going to have a revival, we're going to have an outpouring, we absolutely must put the Bible back into front and center of everything that is going on in Christianity. And if it doesn't pass scriptural muster, then we throw it out. Period. End of conversation. Next topic.
Well, and I think that's something we don't like to talk about, but if we're honest, many people are informed more by popular culture than they are by the Bible in terms of their theology, their worldview, their Bible knowledge. I've been saying this whole last year as we walk through what has been a very difficult season, and I think as we enter into 2022, will continue to be interesting at least. But it's a back to basics season, where we need to get back into God's word. We need to get in our prayer closets. We need to be really pursuing those traditional spiritual disciplines, not unlike what you described, reading scripture with our families and just getting our heads into the word so the word can get into our heads. I loved what you said about you would be kind of stopped cold with this thought of, I'm my grandfather's grandson, my grandmother's grandson, that there was really a spiritual legacy or spiritual heritage that sounds like it was resting upon you that God used to great fruit in your life. That's really intriguing to me. I've never heard somebody quite share something like that before.
Yeah. Well, and the fact that you haven't, and you do as many interviews as you do, and you travel as widely as you do in Christian circles, you're in the publishing industry. I mean, you would have thought I'm not saying you even half of the people you'd speak with would have this, but you'd think you'd have enough such stories that mine would not be that unusual. But in fact, it really is. And so I'm really grateful for it. I'm not sure I was always grateful for it when I was younger. But, Paul even said to Timothy that, he inherited something from his mother and his grandmother. And he said, and you've known the scriptures since your youth, and they're able to make you wise unto salvation. That little piece of Timothy's life, something of that, I think, is part of my own story.
And I'm, not to say I'm discouraged at all, in the sense that probably in the past 2 years, I've heard, especially in our spirit-empowered charismatic spaces, people starting to talk about legacy and generations, and really doing an about face or a correction to make sure that we're pouring into the generations that are coming after us. Like I heard this a ton in the homeschool movement 10 to 15 years ago, generations and legacy. And then it kind of went dormant for a while. And then now it almost feels like the charismatic space is picking up this mantle and running with it, which strongly encourages me. We definitely need that. In terms of my context for you, Ken, I think you've been on my radar probably for 7 or 8 years, mostly through my brother-in-law, Putty, and other mutual friends that we have. But it doesn't sound like you always were in what we would say is a spirit-empowered or charismatic ministry context. I'm curious, when did the supernatural, so to speak, break through into your life? Where did that show up on your journey?
Well, when I went off to college at age 18, I got there, and I'd had, I would say, I had had a decisive encounter with God the summer after my senior year in high school. And people have asked me, did you get saved then, or what was that? And I'm not really sure how to characterize it. I might have gotten saved then. I might have thought I was saved and I was wrong prior to that time. Or I had been saved because certainly my grandmother and grandfather evangelized me, and I went forward at church and prayed the sinner's prayer and all that. So maybe I was saved, but during that period of a bit of drift during my junior and senior years of high school, especially the senior year, maybe I just became lukewarm and was not really switched on for God anymore, because I always had kind of a God consciousness all through my youth and even in my high school years. And so when, a lot of my friends were chasing down, we had a harbor near us. When my friend and drugs were smuggled in from Mexico at that harbor, I lived in Southern California, about roughly 2 hours drive north of the Mexican border. So drugs would be smuggled in through that harbor. There was a lot of that around. Of course, there was drinking, and everyone's discovering sex. So there was a lot of that. I didn't get involved in any of that. at all, none. And so, and it was part of that God consciousness, that sensitivity to the things of God that I'd acquired through my upbringing. But anyway, during my senior years, I say I drifted a bit. And so that summer following senior year, I had a God encounter that was quite dramatic, quite decisive, really shifted the course of my life permanently. And really, it was out of that I went off to college. So when I arrived on the university campus, I was young and filled with fire. And I very early on got connected with a group of like-minded believers. And I hung around with them for my entire college experience. I had other Christian groups I related with as well. So early on, I had this kind of ecumenical bent. And I was a worship leader with the Catholic chaplaincy, which is kind of strange as a Protestant, but anyway, it's what I did. My grandmother was pulling her hair out when that was going on. But I did that. I did some things with the Presbyterians and the Methodists, and I interacted with the Eastern Orthodox. Again, my grandmother pulled her hair out. But anyway, this one group was like a pole star for me, and I stayed with them the whole time. And it was really there that I got baptized in the Holy Spirit, and that was my freshman year. And when I told my grandmother about it, she didn't know what to say, because we didn't do that in the Wesleyan tradition. But on the other hand, she knew John Wesley's journals, and she couldn't dismiss it. And in our own family, we had a legacy of some supernatural stuff, stories that circulated. Many of my cousins don't know those stories. I know them because I lived with my grandparents, and my grandma and grandpa would tell me about these stories, miraculous healings, visitations, things like that. I'm not saying there were 50 of them. There were maybe 3 or 4, but the point is, it was in our lore as a family. So anyway, during my time in college, I had read the Bible through several times, again, at the behest of my own family. And by the way, they paid me to do it, so that was an incentive also. But anyway, in college, I wanted to know the Bible better. And so I started reading it on my own, developed my own Bible reading plan, which I followed quite assiduously for several years. And in the midst of all of that, around my junior year, I started asking God some very pointed questions. And I said, Lord, why is it that I read the Bible and I see all this supernatural stuff? And it could be David and Goliath. It could be fire falling from heaven with Elijah. I could point to other things too, Moses and the Egyptians, whatever. But also in the life of Jesus and the apostles, there was all this healing and deliverance. And I said, I don't know anybody who's ever seen anything like this. Where is this? I don't get this. And so that was kind of the nature of our interaction for several months. And I was very persistent at bugging the Lord about this. And in those years, I would typically get up, believe it or not, as a college student, I would get up about 5 a.m. I would go to an old stone Episcopal church down the street, and I would pray there from 6 until 8. They'd have a morning service. I'd go to that, and then I would go off to class. So I was like, the first 2 hours of my day were given to prayer and Bible reading, and I would typically do that on my knees, which again, kind of strange, but that's what I did. Anyway, so I had this conversation going with the Lord about all of this stuff. And one day, a woman in my church walked up to me, and she had a bag filled with cassette tapes, an ancient technology that's no longer known to modern man. But anyway, she'd given me these cassette tapes, and she said, I was praying this morning, and I felt led of the Lord that you needed these. And so she gave me this bag of John Wimber tapes. And I started listening to them on my Sony Walkman, again, an ancient technology no longer known to modern man. But this just completely blew me to a new level, because I was already ardent and I was already asking about a lot of this stuff. And here was a guy who seemed to know what he was talking about and who had lots of stories that sounded very credible. So it wasn't too long after that I took my mother to a service at the Vineyard, which at the time was in Yorba Linda. Today it's in Anaheim, California, but it's a difference without a meaning. They're less than a mile apart. And my mother, when we walked into the service, she had open, oozing sores in her mouth, many, many, many of them. They were all about the color of a raisin, a traditional raisin, not the new golden ones. And they were all roughly, about that size, about the end of my finger there. And I mean, she was holding a rag over her mouth because it was so painful. She'd been to the doctor, she'd been to the dentist, she'd been to the oral surgeon. Nobody knew what this was. Well, so we walk in, and long story short, I take her in the back room after the service, and in about 30 seconds, she gets healed. Every one of those sores vanished. All the drooling stopped, everything. She was fine. She didn't know what to do with this. This was outside of her, as we would say, ken, no pun intended. And there were two young women that had prayed for her that I still know to this day. And they were kind of blown away. Well, this kind of launched me further down the path. And I thought, I got to be around this. I mean, if this is the deal, then this is what I've been looking for: real, authentic, full-scale Bible Christianity. I mean, I knew doctrine, I knew morality, but this thing of power and signs and wonders, this was totally different. And it was really when I got involved in the Vineyard that I got drawn into the deliverance ministry. And so John Wimber had me in various roles. He would take me places with him. There were other people that I came alongside of, notably Blaine and Becky Cook, but there were some other people as well. And I learned from them, and I was very fortunate in that the people I was learning from were very knowledgeable, very skilled. They were, I would say, balanced in their approach to things. And so, I learned by being around it. I learned by doing. Of course, that context no longer really exists. John Wimber died this coming year. It'll be 25 years. Blaine and Becky are still alive, but their lives are kind of pointed in a somewhat different direction, although they do still engage in ministry. And so that context, I would say, is not replicable. But when the Lord pulled me out of my business career about 12 years ago, I started traveling heavily, and things just went crazy. I mean, I already knew about deliverance. I was busy with it. I saw a lot of fruit in it. But that was through the years previously, and things just went to a completely different level starting about 12 years ago. And I would say they've continued to climb. It hasn't been, one linear climb. There have been some plateaus and then more ascent. But I mean, I see things now. I do things now that are like way beyond anything we knew back then. And I remember one time I went to breakfast with John's. Well, she's now remarried, so I don't know if it's quite proper to say widow, but Carol, then Wimber, now Wong, and her new husband. And we were talking, and I said, Carol, I don't know if I'm like out of bounds here, because I'm doing stuff you never taught us. And, I would tell her stories, and she always wanted to hear the stories of what was going on with my journeys. And she just looked at me and she said, Ken, what we taught you was Deliverance 1.0. We shared what we had. She said, the Lord's clearly just taken you on a journey and brought you to a totally different place with this. If we taught you Deliverance 1.0, you're like 8.0 or 9.0. Keep going. You have my blessing anyway. And so that encouraged me, emboldened me, and I continued on. And we've just seen many, 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 many breakthroughs through deliverance in that time. And I might add, this is a bit out of sequence, but it's still worth noting. When I was 19 years old, I came home from college for the summer, and I got involved in a church near my home. And there was a woman in that group who was unquestionably demonized, but nobody knew what that was, and no one had any language for it. And most importantly, nobody knew what to do with it. And during that summer, we went to an area of California known as Big Sur. It's along the coast, kind of between San Francisco and Los Angeles. One night, we were around the campfire, and I kid you not, we were literally, in all truth, we were singing Kumbaya. Yes, we were. And so, we got our arms around each other, and we're swaying, and Kumbaya, my Lord, Kumbaya. So we're doing this. And our pastor, again, he knew nothing about deliverance. He knew as much as we knew. He walked across the circle that was around the campfire. And this woman that I described, she was there. There was always something unusual about her. She had this very dark look to her face, almost like she'd been smeared with ash. There was a distant kind of gaze in her eyes. Many times, if you looked in her eyes, it was like they were a bottomless pit of blackness. And she would periodically just spontaneously vocalize profanities and blasphemy and other things. People kind of wondered, but again, we didn't have any context, and this was a church that just didn't have any background with this. And I mean, I didn't have anything, and we didn't do this in the Wesleyan tradition, and our pastor knew nothing. So we're just, here we are. He walks across the circle and he puts his hands on her head, and he said her name. And then he said, "Can you say Jesus is Lord?" And she went berserk. She threw him back through the air, and he landed in the fire. And 4 people jumped on her, taking her to the ground. And there was one woman in our group who had moved out from Chicago. And from memory, she might have been 25, 27 at the time. She sits on this woman's chest. So we have one on each limb. And then this social worker from Chicago sitting on the woman's chest. And this woman is blaspheming. It's like a volcano's erupting. She's blaspheming. She's cursing. I mean, it's insanity. Several people grab the pastor, pull him out of the fire. They're throwing coats on him. And, fortunately, he wasn't harmed. But I mean, and in those days, nobody even had cell phones, right? This is ancient technology. So somebody ran back to the entrance of the campground and called her parents on the payphone and said, "Something's happened. You need to come get your daughter. We don't know what to do with her." And so it's a several-hour drive from LA up to that area. And in the middle of the night, the parents arrived and they took her away, and we never saw her again. And I mean, I didn't have language for what it was, but I thought to myself at that time, I never, ever, ever want to see that happen again to anybody. And that was always in the back of my mind. And it kind of fueled some of that inquiry I had going with God about, okay, why do I not see this going on in the church? And so when I started to see breakthrough and started to see success in deliverance ministry, it was like, it was payback time. The devil had won that one, and the Christians had lost that one. That was a match, not a war. But since then, I've seen the Lord be so gracious to set so many people free of so many things. Sometimes it's mental illness, although I'm not saying that all mental illness is demonic. Sometimes it's physical illness, because even the scripture shows us that there are times when physical maladies, diseases, and kinesiology problems, these can arise from demonic activity in people's lives. Sometimes it's emotional stuff. Sometimes it's addictions. I mean, there's a lot of different vectors this can take. But I've never seen the Lord lose on one of these. We've had times where we fought it to a draw, but in the end, Jesus always wins. And that's actually one of my signature talks now. It's called Jesus Wins. I have it on my website if people want to get it and listen to it. And it goes through a lot of case studies, but it gives a lot of theology wrapped around how does this really work? Why does it work? What makes this really go on? And so it's now at the place where, it's many years on from sitting around my grandparents' dining room table. It's many years on from that campground in Big Sur, California, decades on. But the thing that I see is that there is a rising tide of deliverance. The Lord is sending a wave of deliverance across the earth because there is so much evil. There is so much wickedness. People don't even know it. They're collaborating with the devil, and they are coming under his power, and their lives are in ruins and in chains, and they literally don't know how to get out of it. And as I love to say, when deliverance is what you need, nothing else will do. Not inner healing, not sozo, not TPM, not RTF, not Emmanuel prayer, not more Bible reading, not more communion, not more intercession. None of that works. When deliverance is what you need, that's the only thing that's going to solve the problem. And I'm not really sure how it ended up this way. I guess just, force of repetition. But nowadays, I get a lot of calls from all over the world, people wanting deliverance. And, honestly, the caseload is more than I can carry. And so now I've got a group of people that are rising up around me, and we're about to launch a prayer network in the first quarter of 2022. for those who need prayer. And, I only have as many hours in the day as I have, so I just can't see everyone. I do what I can. But anyway, I'm always blown away by the things that I see Jesus do in setting people free.
And that's been my experience over the past 6+ months, just talking to a wide range of deliverance ministers and people involved in exorcisms, even in the Catholic Church. The need is great. A number of the people I talk to, they'll talk about how 10 years ago they'd get 200 requests a year. Now it's 2,000 requests a year, and that it's just the need is more than any one group of ministers are able to deal with. Ken, I'd be curious to hear in terms of, you described in your conversation with Carol. She said what you learned in the vineyard was kind of Deliverance 1.0, and the space you're in now is like 8.0 or maybe 10.0. Who knows? Maybe you've progressed further. I'm just curious if you had to contrast the differences in what you're seeing, or process wise, how it looks different. I'm just curious. Obviously, you grow in experience and wisdom or have grown in experience and wisdom along the journey. I'd just love to hear how it looks different from when you were starting out to what you're seeing now.
Well, I think we were a lot more tentative. And when I say we, I mean, the leaders that I was training with, because I was certainly not the main guy at that point. We were much more tentative. We used to be very cautious to say, let's not call it a demon until we know it's a demon. There are things now that when I get around it, I'm just like, that's a spirit and we're going to drive that out. And it's not that I like to label everything a demon. I'm cautious not to do that, because to modify an old saying, if everything's a demon, then in the end, nothing's a demon. So I don't label everything a demon, but when I know what I've got, I'm much quicker to go immediately to engage the target. So that would be a change. I think the scope of things that I now understand to be demonic is far, far, far wider than it used to be. And again, that's part of that early caution that we had in the earliest years of the vineyard. So that would be another big difference. There are also a lot of things that maybe before I didn't really realize were as problematic as they were. Just to name one simple thing, Freemasonry. I have an entire teaching on Freemasonry, and we've driven that out of many people in every country of the world, seemingly. I've even run into it in Asia, believe it or not. But, in those years, we just had no sensibility that Freemasonry was demonic. We just thought it was some kind of little bit different religious thing. And after all, they claimed to believe in God. And in fact, the vineyard, its first kind of permanent lodgement, when it left being just home groups in people's living rooms, was actually the Yorba Linda Masonic Lodge. I would never consider holding church in a Masonic lodge today, not at all. To me, that's like walking into Chernobyl, because it's radioactive spiritually, and you can't get it out. I don't care what anybody says about how we're going to assert our authority and cleanse the area. The Catholic Church tried that in medieval Europe, taking over temples and things of, gods like Jupiter or whatever. And they would cross off the name and put up some saint's name and dedicate it as a church. And that's really, I think, underneath what gave us the syncretism that we often view within Catholicism. I'm not saying all Catholicism is syncretistic, but a lot of it is. And I think that's where it comes from. And if you need a better picture of that, take a look at what it looks like in Latin America. And so, we just didn't have any sensibility about stuff like that. And, it used to be, I used to engage in a lot of argumentation with people like Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, trying to explain to them or argue them based on the Bible why, this way's right and this way's wrong. And what I now clearly understand is that there is literally a spirit behind all of that false teaching. Paul even says it explicitly in 1 Timothy 4:1-2. But if you don't have the eyes to see it when it's on the page, you'll gloss right over it and it won't sink in. And, based on just that one understanding, I've seen many cases of people who were coming out of families that were formerly JW or Mormon, whatever they were, they were coming out of that. And as they came out of it, we would deliver them of their evil spirits. And they would also simultaneously get healed of any number of things. Food allergies is one example, but there are many other things that they would get delivered from. And that was because the spirits that had empowered the doctrine were afflicting the people who were the hosts. Well, we had no understanding of any of that stuff, or if we did, I don't remember it. Maybe someone was talking about it. But anyway, those would just be a few examples of things that have changed a lot for me in the last, whatever, dozen years.
And in terms of gateways or open doors in people's lives to demonic oppression, I mean, you'd mentioned coming out of kind of cults. Obviously, in the many conversations I've had with folks who operate in this space, trauma, abuse will often contribute to people needing deliverance. Any unexpected doorways or gateways people might be opening and not realizing in this season?
Well, the trauma is an interesting one, and I think for some that would be unexpected. But I think we can all stipulate to the fact that there's always been trauma in the world. There's always been war, there's always been rape, there's always been murder, and these things are traumatic. And so I think they, from time immemorial, have been open gateways. But we may not have described them in that way because our spiritual sensibilities were degraded. And Jesus's disciples had this problem too. It says their eyes were closed, or he would say, "You have eyes to see, but you do not see. You have ears to hear, you do not hear." He said that more to the crowds than his disciples, but even to his own disciples, he would at times say, "Do you still not understand?" So that's certainly a category. But let's talk about a couple that people may not think much about. Drug use of any kind. Now, obviously, there are what we call ethical or prescription drugs. I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to all the pot that billions of people have smoked in the last 2 generations since pot became a thing in the 1960s. Now we have even more powerful things than, back then. I mean, the heavy stuff was like heroin, or, maybe the intermediate level was cocaine. And of course, we had black beauties and quaaludes and things like that. Any or all of that might be an open door. But now we have even more powerful psychogenic drugs like, say, ayahuasca. And I've actually cast demons out of people who have used ayahuasca seeking to become more prophetic as Christians. And they should have known better than to be doing that. But hey, anything in pursuit of an experience, right? And then we can talk about all of the immoral and illegal sex that's going on. And by illegal, I don't just mean people who have been trafficked. That would certainly qualify. I don't want to take it off the list. But, there is so much immorality. And Paul even uses this identical language in one of his letters. He says, since there is so much immorality, each of you should have a spouse and hold them in dignity and in honor. And it's clear from his language that he's saying, look, God gave you marriage so that you would have an avenue, an outlet for those urges. But, today, virtually nobody abstains from sex until marriage. And even in Christian circles, well, we're living together because we're going to be married in 3 weeks anyway. Yeah, but you're not married. Well, but, God knows our needs and it's more economical and the apartment was ready now. Yeah, but you're living in sin. And, there's just no sensibility to that sort of thing. So sex is a huge entry point. Any kind of false religious activity. And this can go down the list from, I once was practicing yoga and seeking cosmic consciousness, which is really, yoga is just Hinduism. It's a form of Hinduism. And I know I just offended 2/3 of your listeners, but we just have to talk about it because we drive these spirits out of people all the time. So it could be Hinduism and its variants. It could be Buddhism. It could be Taoism, which, by the way, the main evangelistic tool for Taoism is the movie series Star Wars. We can talk about outright witchcraft. There's a lot of people who think Harry Potter is really cool. So we go down the list with that. We can talk about Christian cults. I named a couple of them earlier, but there are some others. And then there are these really bizarre ones like, the Temple of the Ascended Masters or Est or whatever. These were more popular in the 70s and 80s. They're not so popular now, but you still run into people that have done this stuff. And if they've not had deliverance, they probably need it because they got tangled up in that stuff. And that might well be the source of all their crazy or their health problems or whatever issues they're dealing with now relationally. I mean, there's a lot of ways that this stuff can afflict people. So that would be another one where people often they just have no clue. And so many times when you bring it up, there's extreme pushback. And believe me, I don't like getting into those conversations. I don't want to be a contentious person, but truth is truth. And literally, I mean, I've driven demons out of tens of thousands of people in the course of my life now. And all I can say is experience tells me that these are the way things really work. And it's in the scripture. But again, we've tended to take the scripture and make it mean what we want it to mean rather than what it clearly means. And so people end up in a pit because of behaviors they've adopted.
And for the person wondering, do I need deliverance? Do I need to be ministered to in this way? Are there any warning signs, hallmarks of oppression, things that people should be aware of that maybe it's for them or for somebody in their life? Are there any kind of common indicators of a problem?
Well, there's a lot of common indicators, but sometimes these are just natural things too. So you need a bit of balance. You need the gift of discerning of spirits. But some common indicators would be, dreams that trouble you, apparitions that appear in your home, shadows in corners and things where it's not just the lighting. You can take a flashlight and shine it there and still, what is that up there? So it could be anything like that. Sometimes it's people who I would just say they're stuck. They have behaviors that are problematic. They're not productive. They're whatever they are. And they don't know why they can't fix it, why they can't change it. They actually might want to change it. The scripture uses the language of bondage. And so did the great theologians like Augustine. But they are in bondage. They literally cannot free themselves from the thing that they are caught in, and they need sometimes to be delivered of evil spirits that have them entrapped. And this could be all kinds of sexual deviancy. That would be one. Addictions, which would include drugs, but could be other things also. Various kinds of personality profile issues. They're a rage-filled individual, or they're always on a hair trigger, ready to go off. Things like that are more of an emotional nature. Illnesses that are weird. No one can figure out why they're there. There's no particular diagnosis, but they're suffering terribly. The doctors are kind of scratching their heads. That would be another indication that there may be something demonic. If anyone has any sort of black magic or witchcraft or Ouija boards, tarot cards, they went to a fortune teller, they had their palm read, they did water dowsing at some point on their grandpa's farm or something. They went down the hole with Buddhism or Hinduism or whatever. I mean, all of these would be indicators that something is really wrong. And if they can't seem to settle down on a more conventional spirituality, conventional being defined by biblical norms, that would be an indicator that there's probably demonic activity that needs to be evicted as well. That's just kind of a laundry list off the top of my head. I have much more detailed information on this in my basic deliverance series, which is again available through my website, orbisministries.org.
And Ken, for the person who feels called into deliverance ministry, obviously you have training resources, but books, resources, things that you would recommend for somebody, maybe one for the person who's just starting out, and maybe for the person who has already been through all the 1.0 material and wants to keep progressing. What are some of the things you'd recommend?
Well, as I mentioned, I've got this series that they could get off of my own website. That would be one place to begin. If they want to go to the next level, I have online training classes with TAs that I've mentored and trained. And then I do direct training with people through webinars monthly as part of our school. So that would be a next level if they want to go there. And then if they really get involved, they can, travel with me and we can do ministry together, and I can give them some one-on-one training and coaching. I mean, I obviously don't do that with everybody every time, but I take teams with me on trips with the objective of training people and coaching them in this so they become fluent quickly. And then there's a couple of books. There's not a lot of books that I recommend on deliverance because a lot of them are somehow imbalanced in one way or another, even if they have nuggets of truth in them. For a lot of people that are just getting started, it's kind of confusing figuring out what's what. But I really like Francis McNutt's book. He just went to be with the Lord last year. He has a book on deliverance, and I think it's from a Catholic perspective. So if you're going to be offended by that, don't get it. But Francis was a very ecumenical guy. He was a very godly man, very well read, educated, and had a very powerful ministry. You might get Francis McNutt's book on deliverance. I'm writing one. Probably won't be out until next year. Well, actually, we're still in 2021. So probably won't be out till 2023, but I am writing a book on deliverance. So when it comes out, you might want to get my integrated guide to healing and deliverance.
And I'll give a second for Francis McNutt's book. I believe it's called Deliverance from Evil Spirits.
Yeah, that's it.
That was one of the very early books that Putty actually recommended, and probably still one of my favorite books in terms of a great quality, scholarly, and just very balanced introduction. Now, it's not scholarly in the sense that it's not readable, but just a very balanced, well-researched, well-written approach. Ken, in terms of people connecting with you, finding out more about your ministry, where do we discover you on the web?
You can find me at my website, Orbis, ORBIS, orbisministries.org. That's kind of our, ground zero. We have a podcast that's available through Apple and Google Play. It's also broadcast across YouTube, and Charisma carries it as well. The podcast is called God is Not a Theory. So I think we've missed a couple weeks, but generally we broadcast every Thursday. So you might want to connect with us through the podcast. If you're interested in our school, you can link through our website to get there, but we have a standalone website for the school. The school is orbissm.com. SM is for School of Ministry.
And like we do with every episode, we'll make it easy. We'll have links to the websites mentioned, resources, all the things. So you can just click on through and get the information that's going to be relevant and helpful for you. Ken, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. I've wanted to have you on the show for a long time, so glad we could finally make that happen. And thank you for pouring into us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, maybe sometime I can come back and tell a bunch more stories. And we didn't get into the stories so much, but yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great, and it's good to see your face.